All right, so today we're diving deep into some Vedic astrology.
Sounds good.
Yeah, and specifically, we're going to be looking at Krittika Nakshatra.
Oh, yeah. I'm excited for this one.
I know, right?
Right?
We've got some really cool material to go through, which I think really gets into the nuances of Krittika.
Absolutely.
So hopefully by the end of this deep dive, we'll all have like a much clearer picture
Yeah.
of what this nakshatra is all about and, how it might play out in our lives.
It's interesting right off the bat just thinking about where Kritika sits in the zodiac because it doesn't fall neatly into just one sign.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the first pada, the first quarter of Kritika falls in Aries, but then the other three padas are actually in Taurus.
Huh. Okay, so it's kind of got a foot in both worlds.
Exactly. And
There.
and if we think about the zodiac as this like cosmic blueprint, sometimes you hear it referred to as like the Kalpurish chart,
Right.
Aries that corresponds to the first house of the chart, which is all about you as an individual, right? So your physical body, your health, even the way you think.
Right.
And then Taurus that lines up with the second house,
Okay.
which is more about like your resources. So family, the face, even the sense of taste. So even just from that, you can start to see how themes connected to these really basic areas of life are going to be important if Kritika is a big influence in your chart.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we often think about our sun sign or our moon sign, but we start to look at these nakshatras.
Mhm.
It really does give you a much more nuanced understanding of, how these different energies play out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, we should probably talk about the actual symbolism of Kritika,
Yeah, for sure.
because I know it has to do with like a knife or a blade.
Yeah, the primary symbol is like a knife or a blade,
Right.
which immediately you think of the word critical, right? And it turns out that that's not a coincidence because the word kritika itself is supposed to come from roots that mean, critical or to cut. But what I found really insightful and in the material we're looking at is how they talk about the nature of being critical. Because so often we think of that as a negative thing, being
Yeah.
judgmental or
Like
envious.
overly critical,
Yeah.
right? Picking everything apart.
Exactly. But when you step back and you think about it, being critical can also be a driver of positive change.
Well, yeah, it's true.
When we analyze things carefully, when we're discerning, that's how we refine ideas and make progress.
It's how we learn.
Exactly.
Huh.
I mean, think about fields like science and art. A critical eye is essential for improvement.
Yeah, it's how we get better.
Right. It's not just about finding fault.
It's about seeing what can be improved.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the material suggests that, if Kritika is prominent for you, this cutting nature might show up in different ways.
Uh-huh.
You might have a really sharp intellect, or express your thoughts very directly and incisively, or even, a knack for like witty remarks that cut right to the point.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It all connects back to that symbolic blade.
Absolutely. So let's shift gears for a minute
Yeah.
and actually look up at the stars because
Okay.
Krittika Nakshatra corresponds to the Pleiades constellation,
Oh, yeah?
which is an open cluster of stars, a pretty noticeable one.
Okay.
If you were to look through a telescope, you can typically see 6 main stars in the Pleiades, but there's actually an older tradition of talking about 7 stars.
Oh, interesting.
And that's what I think gets really cool because astronomically speaking, this star cluster, it's not just beautiful to look at. It's associated with a lot of heat and radiation.
Huh.
So that's like a key point that ties back into one of the big themes with Kritika, which is this element of fire, which we're going to explore more in depth.
Okay, yeah, well, let's get into that.
Yeah.
Because I'm really curious about how that plays out.
So, putting this astronomical detail into a historical context, the material points out a fascinating alignment.
Okay.
So around 1600 to 2600 BCE.
Wow, that's a long time ago.
It is, right. A major astronomical event was happening, the vernal equinox.
So that's when like day and night are equal, marking the beginning of spring.
Exactly. And this vernal equinox was occurring in the area of the sky occupied by Kritika. And what's really interesting is that time frame coincides with the peak of the Indus Valley civilization.
Really?
Yeah.
So a major celestial event happening at the same time as like a major civilization.
Yeah, you start to wonder about the connections, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And the material even touches on a possible link to the Pashupati seal,
Okay.
which has been found at those Indus Valley sites.
And remind me, what is the Pashupati seal?
So the Pashupati seal, it often shows like a figure surrounded by animals. And if you think about Kritika's connection to the second house, right, which we said is about animals and agriculture and even trade, it makes you think, maybe the timing of this alignment and the symbolism on the seal could be meaningful somehow.
Wow. Yeah, that's super fascinating. And for the listener, that might hint at Kritika's influence being connected to, periods of growth and establishment, nurturing resources, all those kind of second house themes.
Yeah, and that kind of historical context naturally leads us to think about the Vedic connections.
Okay.
So the Rig Veda, which is one of the oldest and most foundational texts of Hinduism,
Right.
it prominently features Agni, the god of fire.
Okay.
And the material that we're looking at suggests that this emphasis on Agni in that Vedic period might be directly linked to the vernal equinox being in Krittika.
Oh, okay.
So it kind of underscores how important fire was to, the understanding of the cosmos and ritual during that era.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating to think about how these ancient cultures really looked to the stars and saw these patterns and connected them to their own understanding of the universe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And another major deity during that time was Indra, the god associated with rain.
Right, right.
The material even mentions stories like Indra's interaction with Krishna, over the worship of Govardhan Hill. And these kinds of stories illustrate the dynamics between these powerful figures.
Right. So right from its astronomical roots to its historical and Vedic significance, it seems like Krittika is really deeply interwoven with, fundamental aspects of how we've understood the universe and our place in it.
For sure. And speaking of Agni,
Yes.
let's talk more about the specific deity that's linked with Krittika.
Okay.
Because Agni, as the god of fire, he embodies a really interesting duality.
Okay.
On the one hand, fire is essential for life.
Right. We use it to cook our food to stay warm for protection.
Yeah, it's a source of sustenance and comfort.
Right.
But then on the other hand, fire is also a powerful force of destruction.
Oh, yeah. It can burn. It can be so dangerous.
It's a force that commands respect.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what's really interesting, I think, is Agni's role as a mediator. So in Vedic rituals, offerings are placed into the fire, and it's believed that Agni carries those offerings to the gods.
Right.
So he acts as like a messenger, bridging the gap between the human and the divine.
So if Krittika is prominent for you, you might have that potential to act as a connector, someone who brings people together or different ideas together.
Yeah, and just like a fire needs fuel to keep burning.
Right.
The material highlights that individuals influenced by Krittika, they have a strong need for love and affection.
Yeah, that makes sense.
To feel sustained and secure.
It's like their fuel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if that emotional fuel isn't consistently provided,
right,
they might, experience some inner challenges.
It's like the fire might go out.
Yeah, and mirroring Agni's potential for both creation and destruction, the material also suggests that if Krittika individuals they're not nurtured or their energy isn't channeled in a positive way, they could potentially have like a negative impact.
Oh, wow.
Even be self-destructive or cause harm to those around them.
It's a powerful energy.
It is a potent energy that needs, mindful direction.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, speaking of direction, the material connects Krittika to the southeast direction, which is known as Agniya, which is directly associated with Agni.
Right, right.
And it also gives us this like broader view of other directional deities and their corresponding nakshatras, which I think is really interesting. It shows how the Vedic system integrates these celestial bodies with, the cardinal and ordinal directions.
So like a cosmic map.
Yeah, it really is.
Okay.
So, for example, Yama is linked to the south and Harani Nakshatra Vayu to the northwest and Swati and so on.
Oh, wow. So it's like this whole system of correspondences.
Right. It really illustrates a universe where everything is interconnected.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, it is. And the material even touches on a possible connection between Ketu and Kubera with Apajit Nakshatra, although it notes that those directional links are a little bit more firmly established for the other ones.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense that there would be some areas where there's a little bit more debate or different interpretations.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. And what I think is really cool?
What's that?
Is when the material kind of dives into the various names of Agni. That are found in the Rig Veda.
Oh, interesting.
Because these names, they're not just descriptive, they actually reveal different aspects of Agni's essential nature and functions.
Okay, I'm curious. Give me some examples.
So like Pavaka, which means purifier.
Oh, yeah.
Havya Vahana, carrier of sacrificial butter.
Okay.
And Saptajiva, he who has 7 tongues.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
Right.
So Pavaka, the purifier,
yeah,
again, reinforces that theme of burning away what's impure or unnecessary.
Right.
Habhyavahana directly speaks to his role as the intermediary in rituals. And then Saptajiva, with his 7 tongues, paints this more, mystical picture of fire's ability to kind of perceive and interact with different realms.
Yeah, and the material lists a bunch of other names too, like Vahani, which means traveling with the wind, Anela, which is fire itself,
Right.
Chitra Banu, colorful light,
Wow.
Vasu, whose light is wealth.
Okay.
So, each name kind of adds another layer to our understanding of Agni and by extension Krittika.
Right, right. So to really grasp, the story behind Krittika, we need to understand the story of Agni's role in the birth of Kartikeya,
Yeah.
also known as Shanmuga.
Exactly.
So what is that story?
So the story goes that Agni carried this powerful fireball destined for Earth.
Okay.
And he had the help of Vayu, the wind god.
Okay.
But the Earth couldn't handle such intense energy.
That makes sense.
So it was passed on to the Ganga River.
Okay.
But even the mighty Ganga, eventually had to transfer it to the Sarah reeds growing along her banks. Yeah, and this is where the connection to Krittika becomes clear.
Okay.
Because these reeds nurtured the energy until it was discovered by the 6 wives of the Saptarishi, who themselves are associated with the Krittika constellation.
Got it.
So the single fireball then split into 6 sparks.
Okay.
And these 6 celestial mothers, the Krittikas, they nurtured these sparks, which eventually became Kartikeya, the 6-headed deity.
Wow. So that story so beautifully links, the Pleiades, the Krittika Nakshatra, and the very birth of Kartikeya.
Right. And Kartikeya, according to the narrative,
Yeah.
he was born with a very specific purpose, which was to defeat the demon Tarakasura.
Right.
And this origin story provides some key underlying themes that we often see associated with, people who have Krittika as a significant influence in their birth chart.
Right. So it's like the foundational myth lays out some of the common experiences in inner landscapes.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating. So let's look at some of the specific qualities that are traditionally attributed to Krittika Nakshatra itself.
Okay.
What is it like?
So the material describes Krittika as having a tamasic nature.
Okay. And remind us what tamasic means.
So when we talk about the gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas,
Right.
tamas in this context relates to inertia stability and the potential for deep transformation.
Okay.
So think of it as the unmanifest potential.
Okay.
Krittika is also identified as a star of fire,
Makes sense.
possessing dahana shakti, which is the power to burn and purify.
Right.
And the underlying principle, they say, is heat above and light below, positioning it as like the eater for the food of the gods.
That's such a vivid image. I love that.
And the core desire associated with Krittika is burning or purification, again echoing Agni's nature.
Okay.
The drishti, or the gaze, is downward,
Okay.
which can suggest a focus on the material world or this really penetrating insight.
Interesting.
The Gana is Rakshasa, which, can sometimes indicate a more intense or protective or even challenging energy.
Right.
And then the yoni, or the sexual symbol, is the female goat.
A female goat.
Yeah, which is interesting because of its connection to nourishment, milk, cheese, even meat.
Right.
So that directly ties back to those second house themes.
Yeah, family sustenance resources.
Exactly. And then the bird symbol associated with Krittika is the peacock.
The peacock. Oh, that's beautiful.
It is, right. And then it's also associated with Shiva, the transformer,
Okay.
and classified as Kama Purusha, which relates to desires and their fulfillment.
Interesting.
And finally, the nakshatra tree is the cluster fig tree, or gular.
The fig tree. I love figs.
Yeah, and the material even points out some of the traditional medicinal benefits of the fig tree, like helping with digestion, potentially lowering cholesterol, supporting heart health, managing diabetes, improving bone density, and even benefiting the health of our hair and skin.
Wow. So it's like a very grounded, practical connection to the energy of the nakshatra.
It is.
Yeah.
So moving on to the Patara analysis.
Okay.
The material kind of breaks down, how the zodiac signs and their ruling planets influence the different quarters of Krittika.
Okay.
So the first pada falling in Aries, that's influenced by Mars and Jupiter.
All right.
The second and third padas, both in Taurus, they carry the combined influence of Venus and Saturn.
Got it.
And the fourth pada, also in Taurus, is influenced by Venus and Jupiter.
So depending on which quarter of Krittika a planet occupies in your chart, its expression will be colored by these different planetary energies.
Right.
I see.
And then the overarching ruler of Krittika itself is the sun.
Okay.
And it's interesting to see how, Venus, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars keep popping up.
Yeah, they're kind of the recurring players in this nakshatra.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what's really noteworthy here is that the moon's point of exaltation in Taurus at 3 degrees, it falls directly within Krittika Nakshatra.
Wow.
So this highlights a really special connection and a point of peak strength for the moon when it's in this lunar mansion.
It's fascinating.
It is.
So the moon, which represents our emotions and our inner landscape, reaching its full power in a nakshatra, so strongly associated with fire.
Right.
It's an interesting interplay of energies.
It is. And to make these concepts a little more tangible, the material gives us some examples of individuals who have planets in Krittika.
Okay. I'm curious.
So they mention a surgeon with Mars in Krittika who not only developed a surgical knife, which is,
a very literal manifestator.
Very literal manifestation, but also actively fought for people's rights.
So that aligns with Mars's warrior energy and Krittika's potential for decisive action.
Right.
Yeah.
Then there's the inventor of the safety razor blades who had the moon in Krittika.
Another cutting theme.
Another cutting theme, right?
Yeah.
But this time related to personal care and the moon's connection to our routines.
Right.
And perhaps most strikingly, J. Robert Oppenheimer, a central figure in the development of the atomic bomb. He had Mercury in Krittika.
Okay.
And Mercury, governs the intellect communication, understanding complex systems.
Yeah.
So here its placement is tied to this, harnessing of immense fiery power.
It's like a very direct manifestation of Agni's energy through the realm of intellect.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, that's a really powerful example.
Yeah, and these examples really bring to life how those core themes of Krittika can manifest in very concrete ways in people's lives.
Absolutely. And the material also mentions some festivals that are associated with Krittika, like Kartikeya.
Oh, yeah?
It's a beautiful festival of lights celebrated in South India and strongly linked to Shiva and Kartikeya. So again, emphasizing that fire connection.
And it also mentions the Agni ritual, which is a traditional Vedic fire ceremony that's still practiced by many today.
Really?
And it even brings up the Advaryagya in Kerala, which is an ancient Vedic fire ritual that, has been documented in ways that suggest potential effects on weather patterns, like cloud seeding.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it showcases the potential for these fire-based practices to have practical, even environmental impacts.
Oh, that's really cool.
And, speaking of Kartikeya, there's an interesting point that's raised about his exact birth nakshatra.
Okay.
Because a lot of people associate him with Krittika because of the whole, being nurtured by the 6 Krittika mothers.
Right.
But the material refers to lunar calendar calculations that suggest that the 6th day of the bright fortnight of Margashirsha might actually correspond to Dhanishta Nakshatra.
So a different nakshatra.
Yeah. And then it also mentions that some communities, particularly during the festival of Vaikasi Visakam, consider Vaishaka Nakshatra to be Kartikeya's birth star.
Wow, so there's a little bit of debate there.
Yeah, it highlights that while that nurturing connection between Kartikeya and Krittika is undeniable, his precise birth nakshatra might be interpreted differently in different traditions.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
So, bringing together all the key themes that we've explored, it seems like Krittika is associated with the food industry, artistic talents, nourishment.
Yeah.
Especially given the goat symbolism and the moon's exaltation there.
Right.
A potential for experiencing feelings of abandonment.
Yeah.
The careful management of resources, and of course that strong link to Agni and Kartikeya.
Absolutely.
And what's really interesting to think about is the exaltation of the moon, a planet associated with the water element, in Krittika, a nakshatra of fire.
Right.
So it's like this seemingly contradictory pairing
that
can create a really dynamic tension.
Yeah.
Potentially leading to profound emotional depth and creative expression.
Yeah, and the material also briefly mentioned, the lineage of Kashyapa.
Okay.
This significant sage who, through his various wives, is said to be like the progenitor of a lot of different species, including snakes and nagas.
Wow.
And they present this as part of a broader theme of creation and lineage that's often associated with the nakshatras.
Right, yeah, it's like this interconnectedness of all life.
Exactly. And in terms of astrological cycles,
the
material points out that Krittika often serves as like a starting point for certain dasha systems, which are predictive time periods in Vedic astrology, and that it's ruled by the sun.
Okay.
So again, further emphasizing its foundational and radiant qualities.
So there's a lot going on with Krittika.
There is.
Yeah.
And then the discussion goes into the concept of the 3 types of primordial fire.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What are those?
So there's Avaneya, which is the fire of the household.
Okay.
Ahavanaya, the fire of the sacrificial altar,
Okay.
seen as the mediator.
Got it.
And Dakshinani, the fire associated with funeral rites and the ancestors.
So these 3 fires represent different but essential roles of fire in life and ritual.
Exactly. And they're described as forming this kind of triangle associated with the southeast, east, and south directions.
Wow, so a triangle of fire.
Right.
Okay.
And that brings us to the ancient story of Daksha Prajapati's grand yagna. Okay.
Which is a foundational Vedic sacrifice.
Okay.
So the disruption of this yagna leading to Daksha's beheading and then the replacement of his head with that of a goat or ram.
Wow.
That's interpreted in the material as connecting back to that goat-ram symbolism we see in both Aries and Krittika.
Right, right.
So it highlights the cyclical nature of, creation, destruction, and eventual renewal.
And when we think about the traditional iconography of Agni, his 3 feet are said to represent these 3 fires.
Yeah.
So again, solidifying their fundamental importance in his symbolism.
Absolutely. And the disruption of Daksha's yagna by Rudra and the Maruts, that's also linked to the energies of the Nakshatras Parani,
Okay.
which is associated with Mahakali Krittika, linked to Padra or Vajra,
Right.
and Rohini associated with Prajapati.
So it's like all these powerful forces coming together.
Exactly. And it's interesting, the material mentions various clans who trace their lineage back to Agni.
Really?
Yeah, they're collectively known as the Agni Kulas, and they include some prominent Rajput clans in India.
Wow.
And it also draws connections to communities and traditions that revere fire, like the Parsis or Zoroastrians, the Agra community, who are believed to be descendants of Agni, and the fire rituals performed by the Arya Samaj.
So you can see how this reverence for Agni and its associated nakshatra has kind of permeated, cultural and societal structures.
For sure.
Yeah.
And Agni also has these important consorts.
Okay.
Svaha, who's invoked when offering oblations to the heavens,
Okay.
and Svada, who's invoked when offering water to the ancestors.
So these figures underscore Agni's role as like a conduit between the divine and the ancestral realms.
Right.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
It is.
Okay, so I know we talked about Kartikeya's birth story, but the material gives this really fascinating modern analogy, comparing it to a test tube baby scenario. So how does that work?
So, the journey of the initial energy through water, earth, the reeds, and then the nurturing by the 6 mothers is likened to this process of incubation.
And Kartikeya's name, Sarah Janma, meaning born of reeds,
Right.
Further supports that interpretation.
So it's like he's born of this kind of primordial soup in a way.
Yeah, and then when Parvati embraced the 6 individual children, they merged into this single deity with 6 heads, Shanmuga.
Right, right.
And the material draws this parallel here to the concepts of nuclear fusion and fission.
Wow.
The release of immense energy through both the joining and the splitting of elements.
So it's a very powerful transformation.
It is.
Yeah.
And Kartikeya's spear, the Vel, is seen as this powerful symbol of that focused, released energy.
Wow. So it's like the energy that's released when those 6 sparks come together.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the properties of smoldering and welding are also attributed to Agni.
Right.
Which highlights, his capacity to both consume and to join things together through heat.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And the material even connects the 6 tastes we experience as humans, the 6 rasas,
Right.
to the 7 tongues of Agni. And then also links that to the 7 days of the week.
Oh, wow.
Suggesting this deep underlying cosmic order.
So it's like this whole system,
Yeah.
of correspondences.
It is.
Yeah.
And then, Agni's presence in the 3 planes, the heavens, the earth, and Patalaloka, the underworld,
Right.
that emphasizes, his cosmic significance.
Right.
And the idea that rituals involving fire or yagna,
Right.
they have efficacy across all these realms.
Yeah, that's powerful.
And the material also mentions Shatabisha Nakshatra,
Okay.
associated with Varuna, the god of water,
Right.
and Mrigashira Nakshatra,
Okay.
associated with Soma, the lunar deity and sacred drink,
Right.
working in conjunction with Agni to bring rainfall.
So again, you see this balance
Yeah.
between fire and water.
That balance is essential.
Right. Absolutely.
And, the peacock, the symbolic bird of Krittika, is linked to Indra,
Oh, right.
who is often depicted as this masculine, ornate being who dances with joy when the rains come.
Oh, I love that imagery.
It's beautiful.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it connects those themes of fire, Agni, Krittika, and water, Indra, rain.
Yeah.
So, within the human body, the material identifies different forms of Agni.
Okay, like what?
So there's Jatharani,
Okay.
which is our digestive fire.
Makes sense.
Sapta Dadvani, the metabolic fires within our 7 bodily tissues.
Cool.
And Bhutani, the fire present within the 5 basic elements that make up our physical being.
Wow, so it's like fire is really fundamental to our very existence.
It is.
Okay.
And then the path of the sun, referred to as Vani,
Okay.
is also considered a manifestation of Agni.
Okay.
And, in Hindu epic narratives,
Yeah.
Agni plays significant roles like gifting the celestial chariot and the powerful Gandiva bow to the warrior Arjuna,
Right.
and being instrumental in the burning of the Khandava forest.
So it's like he's this active participant.
He
here.
is. He's a powerful force.
Yes, for sure.
And from a yogic perspective,
Okay.
Krittika is presented as like the central point in a cycle, with Prajapati, the creator, on one side,
Right.
and Yama, the god of death or transformation, on the other,
Okay.
leading to fire as the active principle of change and purification.
Interesting.
So the cycle of life itself is viewed through the lens of the elements.
Okay, how so?
So starting with water in the womb, moving to earth at birth, symbolized by the cutting of the umbilical cord.
Which connects to Krittika symbolism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then air with our first breath,
Okay.
linked to Swati Nakshatra.
Got it.
Then fire at the time of death, and eventually returning to water.
Wow, so it's like this beautiful cycle through the elements.
And the material uses some potent imagery to illustrate these connections.
Okay.
So like the horse Ashwini Nakshatra,
Right.
representing the fastest sperm,
Okay.
being symbolically beheaded upon reaching the egg.
Which is linked to the cutting action of Parani Nakshatra.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
It is, right. And then Vayu Swati is positioned opposite to Apahrani, which is associated with Chitra Nakshatra and multiplication. So highlighting, the interplay between these different nakshatras in that cosmic dance of life and death.
Okay, you have that, kids.
And Subramanya, another name for Kartikeya,
Right.
is seen as being positioned between Vali,
Okay.
associated with Vishakha Nakshatra,
Right.
and Devasena, linked to Anuradha Nakshatra.
So emphasizing his central and unifying role.
Right, and the placement of benefic or malefic planets in Krittika is given a very, simple interpretation.
Okay.
So a benefic planet there might suggest the blessing of a good fire or positive past rituals,
Okay.
while a malefic planet could indicate, the fire not being lit at home,
Right.
maybe.